From his lofty perch, we're going to talk about transparency and getting them bureaucrats. It's Mitchell Talks, the News 9 sessions with Aaron Burlbeck. I'm going to dispense with the lofty jokes, that sort of thing, but Legislative Office of Fiscal Transparency, you finally met. This guy's been here when all that sausage making was going on. Yep. But let's just talk about that first meeting. We'll talk about that, what you want to do, but what is LOFT?
So for too long in state government, we've had the fox guarding the hen house when it comes to agency finances. So
you mean bureaucrats?
Right.
Bureaucrats, right.
So what we have is the agencies, they put their budgets together in the fall. And then in the spring, we have our performance evaluation meetings with the subcommittees of the legislature. And the agencies bring documents. Most of the time, it's just paper documents that the legislature gets to look through. And as we start going through those documents and we want to request more information, we have to ask the agency. And the agency, many of them do it right, but some of them, they found a way to slow play the system. If in Oklahoma, we're only in session from February through the end of May. So if an agency has a legislator that keeps pestering them and asking questions that they don't want asked, all they have to do is slow play it for 4 months and make it through the end of session in order to make sure that the status quo is maintained. So what LOFT does is it makes sure that we have year-round staff making sure that agencies aren't able to continue to do this and that we're able to monitor the agency spending to make sure that they're spending it in the appropriate ways.
How large is that staff and what is it comprised of?
Right now, the staff doesn't exist, and so our task as the oversight committee, first off, is to look and try to find an executive director. First, we have to set the job description of an executive director and then find that person who will then hire a staff. We look at the staff potentially consisting of up to 15 people and going from there. And so the things that they're going to be looking at are the agency finances and doing performance audits, and they'll also have subpoena power to be able to obtain those documents that agency heads sometimes might not want the legislature to see. And the other aspect of it too is whenever we have these budget hearings, oftentimes the agencies, they'll say they get $10 million this year and they want $11 million next year. The only thing they talk about is that $1 million increase. Well, I believe as taxpayers and as legislators, it is our responsibility to look at the full $10 million that they got last year. And we need to make sure that the base appropriation that they're receiving isn't a perpetual base and that we're looking at these tax dollars year in and year out to make sure they're being spent appropriately.
So who should be on the staff? Are we looking at accountants? Are we looking at numbers crunchers? Are we looking at political patronage jobs? What are we looking at here?
Well, certainly not the latter, but I believe we need people of different backgrounds. Yes, you need people that are probably accountants that can be able to dig in the numbers. You need people that understand policy, that understand the legislature and our intent whenever we pass different legislation affecting policies. So I think you'll need people of different backgrounds. You might need some attorneys on there as well. And that's something that the working group is working on to determine who it would be best to lead that agency. And one of the unique challenges that we're finding is that many other states that have a similar committee to LOFT, their directors have been in place for 20 plus years, and so they don't have job descriptions on hand, so we have to go and we kind of have to look at what they've done that's successful and look at what we're looking for. The findings that the LOFT comes up with will be released to the public, and anything that we subpoena that might be confidential information would still be, if it's confidential currently with the agency, it would still be confidential with the legislature, but many of the documents we'll be receiving are open records with the agencies themselves. So if we receive a document from DHS that's an open record, a news agency would certainly be able to request that same document from DHS or any other state agency.
We're going to need a sound effect. Whenever he said subpoena power, we need that. You know where the needle hits the record?
Yep.
We probably need that. What caught my eye or caught my ear on this was you said subpoena power. Now, let me just help out with some frequently asked questions. Representative Hilbert says, slow play. That means that the bureaucrats lie to you. Okay, that's number one. Number two, until there were subpoenaed hearings or hearings with subpoena power over the health and tourism departments a couple, 3 years ago. Okay, and then we went into this fiscal meltdown, and then sort of like the focus went away on it. Remember those?
Yep.
Okay, so some of those idiots are still in state government. Bureaucrats, just a couple of these agencies. We got a new administration, and I can see great gains, but some of those bureaucrats are still there. Now, bureaucrats and cockroaches survive nuclear wars, all right? So do bureaucrats. A great lobbyist, whose name I won't divulge right now, told me one time, he said, what happened with term limits was we empowered lobbyists and bureaucrats. And he talked about a certain bureaucrat who said, I was here before this class of legislators, 12 years, maximum you can be there, and I'll be here after they're gone. So the worst kept secret in town is that term limits, which are bad, because you see the brain drain that happens on that. And by the time you have somebody who gets there who knows what's going on, you got to leave. So anyway, but the point is lobbyists and bureaucrats got a lot more powerful because of term limits. You have subpoena power. For years, slow play, that you've been lied to by bureaucrats. So with this subpoena power, just how aggressive is this Loft organization going to be? There are a lot of people for transparency who are like, eye of the tiger, go after them. Then there are some states that are much more subtle about this. Give us an idea of tone and tenor with this legislature and this crop of bureaucrats that you can't get rid of. How's that going to work out?
Well, I believe to your broader point, I think you made a very good point that is a positive reason for Loft, and that is with term limits, the institutional knowledge that we have in Oklahoma City at the state capitol is with the agencies and with the lobbyists. And so you don't have legislators that have been there for a long time that know where the bodies are buried, so to speak, that know how things got where they are. And so by having an agency such as Loft that's under the legislative branch, Loft is a part of the Legislative Service Bureau, so it's a joint venture by the House and Senate. It's not a part of the executive branch, it's a part of the legislative branch. And by having people in these entities, it makes sure that there is institutional knowledge still in the legislature. While it might not be individual legislators that might be there beyond 12 years, you can then have staff people who work for the legislature that are. And as far as how aggressive that the members of Loft will be when they're going after information, I think it really depends on the situation. If once agencies see that Loft is willing to subpoena agencies, is willing to be aggressive with some, then you'll see that others comply. I don't think it's something where you have to be 100% aggressive all the time, but as long as you're selective when agencies are not being compliant, then it will allow other agencies to see, hey, we better comply, we better be transparent with the legislature and with the taxpayers of Oklahoma, because if we don't, there's an agency here, there are staff people that work for the legislature that will be able to find this information anyway.
When do you think you'll have an executive director?
That's hard to say right now. I know what we did at our first Loft meeting is we split the non-chairperson, so the other 12 members of the group, into 2 working groups, and half of us are working on the job title for executive director, and then the other half are working for the policy and the individual rules that will govern Loft. And so before our next meeting next month, we hope to have a job description put together, and from that we'll be able to begin the search process, and hopefully we're able to find one quickly, but I know we definitely want one before the next legislative session begins.
How much work will they actually be able to do between then and the time the legislature wraps up session?
Well, I think it all depends on when we hire an executive director. Obviously, if we hire one sooner, they'll be able to hire their staff sooner, and they'll be able to begin working. And so that's really the start process. Until we have a director, we can't start hiring additional members.
Do you specifically want them to take a look at EPIC?
I think they need to be looking at all areas of state government, and that's certainly one area in particular that the public's very interested in right now. And so I believe that's one area that they would look at, as well as all state spending from all state agencies. A lot of people, when they're talking about Loft, they mention the health department and the fiasco that we had there in the fall of 2017. But I think about another situation that happened at that same time, whenever we were in the fiscal crisis. We had the Department of Human Services that came to the legislature and said, we have to have $25 million in supplemental funding and able to get through the fiscal year. We have to have it right now. And $25 million in the midst of a budget crisis, when you've already had cut after cut after cut, and the veto of Governor Fallon, that was hard to come by. But we made sure that DHS got their money because they told us they had to have it. Fast forward 7 months later, we get to the end of that fiscal year, and DHS finishes with over $30 million in carryover. So maybe if we had Loft at the time, they could look at that and see that agency, maybe you don't need $25 million right now. Maybe instead of looking out for the best interest of your agency, we could look, what's the best interest for the state of Oklahoma? And those $25 million, instead of sitting in the bank and carryover, maybe it could have been spent elsewhere for other state agencies that were hurting.
You had mentioned, Mr. Brebeck, you'd mentioned the concerns. Here's an interesting concern for me. And I've already talked about tourism and health. Mm-hmm. What happens How do you set the agenda? Because that's where I see the politics creeping in. All right, executive director gets on the ground. Today we're going to go here, we're going to go there. There hasn't been a loft before. State of Texas, they got a similar sort of thing there, right? And people have seen that for years. My question is, how are you going to goal set? Because in the wrong hands, something like this could be a weapon. It'd be like having a president who uses
The IRS.
Yeah. So how
That'd never happen.
No, that would never happen. So let me ask you this: how will you legislatively oversight the direction and the focus of Loft?
Well, one of the unique aspects of the Legislative Service Bureau is they're accountable to both the Speaker of the House and the President Pro Tem of the Senate. And so if one of those individuals or the Senate or the House, just one entity on its own, wanted to send LSB in a certain direction and Loft in a certain direction, they wouldn't be able to do that because they report to both sides of the chambers, and that is an area where we're able to oversee that, and also the fact that the committee, we want to put policy in place for Loft that's good not only for this year, this session. We want to make sure Loft is successful long term, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, and so we set it up in such a way, report both to the Speaker and Pro Tem, but also that it's bicameral and bipartisan. There are members of the majority and minority party on there, and so if things start going in a direction that they shouldn't be, or somebody's trying to use the agency for their own personal gain, there are aspects in place to make sure that that can't happen. And you also have news media such as yourselves that, if members of the Oversight Committee are bringing attention to it, I believe the public will see it as well.
I was with you until you started talking about the Capitol Press Corps doing oversight.
Hey, come on.
Present company excluded. Let me, one quick question, then we've got to get out of here. So in other words, if we walk away with this is the Speaker and the Pro Tem are going to have incredible impact on this. But in this particular situation, the executive branch is on the other side. So there's a little cleavage between the executive branch, the governor, and Speaker McCall and Pro Tem Treat. But is that kind of the way it's set up?
Well, absolutely. And I think when you look at long term, we have a great governor now. I believe he's doing an incredible job. But when you look at the long-term success of an agency such as Loft, you want to have it under the legislative branch, not under the executive branch. And when you look at, say Congress with their Congressional Budget Office, it's under the legislative branch, not under the executive. That way you don't have a conflict of interest when the executive director of Loft and his or her staff is looking at agencies to see, what's in the best interest of the people of Oklahoma and the taxpayers of Oklahoma, not what's necessarily in the best interest of who the chief executive might be at the time.
Well, okay, get your popcorn out, right?
It's going to be fun to
Get
watch.
your popcorn out. Representative Kyle Hilbert on the Loft panel met this week. It's going to be interesting to watch. It is going to be a whole new bunch of news stories. And good luck to you.
Absolutely. Thank you all very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks, Mr. Brillback, once again. See this again on News 9 at news9.com/yourvotecounts. I'll get that out. And also follow me on Twitter, if you would, please, at Mitchell Talks.